from here to everywhere is something that we should be absolutely intrigued with. It should absolutely grab our attention to ask the question, how do we get here today? And how do we move forward from today? Can you imagine that it all started with Jesus gathering 12 very ordinary, rough around the edges kind of people, pouring his life into them, inviting them to follow him, pouring everything he had, giving them something to observe and imitate, giving them something to see what it looks like for the tangible love of Jesus to be made real in the lives of other people. That led to you being here today. If I was going to draw up the scheme and the plan of how I would have started something that could reach the entire world, something that could have gone from there to everywhere, I probably would have started with more than 12 people. But the unfortunate side effect of that is I would have created an audience instead of stirring up followers. We would have created a culture where it was good for us to listen to somebody but not imitate the Savior. That led from there to here. And the question I want to ask us today is, how do we get from here to everywhere? We're going to be in Acts chapter 19. In fact, we're going to be all over the book of Acts this morning. So I want to invite you. You're going to want your Bible. You're going to want to be able to turn pages fairly quickly. We're going to be jumping through, and you're going to see the journey of a man who was named Saul and was persecuting the church, who was transformed by the grace of Jesus and became Paul and started leading the church. It's an incredible transition, and considering moving from here to everywhere. I don't know if you ever get like this, but sometimes in the month of January or February, my Google searches are dominated by this search for warm beaches far from here. You ever get that? Like, did you have that streak of searching for those things when the cold spell came through a couple of weeks ago? It was like 0 degrees for more than one day in a row, which in Nashville is absurd. Where I grew up is that's called winter, right? That's like months of time of that. During those seasons, I just HGTV. Anybody ever watched Caribbean Life or Island Hunters or whatever it is? Yeah, I'd love to buy an island every January. It keeps coming up. So every time it gets cold, I start considering, man, I'd love to go on a trip somewhere warm, somewhere tropical, somewhere not cold like this, right? And you think of the destination. You think about how wonderful it must be there. You think about just the sand between your toes and the waves coming up and the clear water and the warm sun and the smell and the sound of palm trees in the air. Can you tell I've been doing my research over the last month? I got it down, you guys. I know where I want to go. I know what that destination looks like, but sometimes getting there is a little bit bumpy, isn't it? I mean, if you're going out of the country, you have that pleasant experience of getting a passport for the first time. You ever go onto the government website and you see all the things that you have to do, and before you mail it in and you hope in 3 months you get something back that looks like a passport, you're kind of thinking, did I do this right? Did I get my picture right? I don't want to get rejected for this. There's the whole process of getting the passport. And then you got to be ready to be away from work for a week, right? So you have the stressful situation of making sure that you have worked ahead in your job. So it's kind of like you're working time and a half or twice as much as you normally are, just so you can be able to be gone for that week, right? So you have that added onto it. And then you have the wonderful experience of packing. Now, I'm sure this isn't stressful for you, but pretend it was for just a moment, right? All the things you have to gather, make sure that everything's good, and when you finally get in a suitcase, you got to make sure that all your house is locked, you got the temperature set, the everything's taken care of, the lights coming on at the right time. I mean, there's a lot to getting to that destination. And so today, we're going to talk about that destination of what everywhere looks like for us as a church. but we're also going to talk about the journey of getting to that destination. In Acts chapter 19, Paul gives us a picture of what the destination looks like. He gives us a glimpse of what everywhere looks like. Look at Acts 19, beginning in verse 8. Here's what Luke wrote in the book of Acts about what Paul did. Verse 8, Paul entered the synagogue and spoke boldly there for 3 months, arguing persuasively about the kingdom of God. But some of them became obstinate. Everybody know what the word obstinate means? Difficult, tough to deal with, stubborn, aggressive, right? I mean, that's what Paul's having to deal with here. But some of them became obstinate. They refused to believe and publicly maligned the way. So Paul left them. He took the disciples. We're going to key on that phrase in just a second. He took the disciples. He wasn't alone. There were other people with him. There were other people watching what he was doing, learning from him, doing life with him, following Jesus with him. He took the disciples with him and had discussions daily in the lecture hall of Tyrannus. This went on for 2 years, so that all the Jews and all the Greeks who lived in the province of Asia heard the word of the Lord. An entire region in a 2-year span heard the word of the Lord. We're going to dive in here in just a moment and discover Paul's pathway and journey to that destination and how this came to be and all the things that he battled through. And it's going to become very prevalent to us just how hard that journey was, that on the way to that destination, there were a lot of bumpy parts. There were a lot of things that maybe are hard for us to believe or see ourselves a part of. But man, in this moment, after Paul has been journeying with these people and these disciples, and they collectively have been sharing the word of the Lord in this region over 2 years, they're able to walk away from that place saying, everyone in this region has heard the word of the Lord. Man, that's worth it. I mean, the thing about a destination, after you make all the arrangements and you talk to the travel agent, and you do all the packing and you get all your work in order so that you can get there, when you finally land, when you get into that vacation place, that destination, oh, you were reminded this was worth it. This is why we waited. This is why we did all that work to get ready for this week so that we could be here, and it is worth it. This is the moment, the destination where Paul says this is worth it. But his journey required some reorientating of his life. There are steps along the way, and I want to trace those with you. In fact, we're going to jump to Acts chapter 8 now. So if you want to trace back to chapter 8, I want you to see the journey that Paul takes. We're going to stop at 3 different places, look at 3 different ways that Paul reorients his life, or 3 paradigms that have to be flipped upside down, if you will, to go where God is calling him, to get to a destination like that one where over the course of 2 years, everybody in a region comes to hear the word of the Lord. It's crazy how much Paul is transformed leading up to this. So in Acts chapter 8, verses 1 through 3, here's a guy named Saul who is the same guy as Paul, but before his transformation, before he was brought to faith by this interaction that he has with Jesus on this road in chapter 9, he was named Saul. And this is what is said about Saul. Look at verse 1. And Saul was there giving approval to his death, referring to Stephen in Acts chapter 7. Stephen has just given this amazing testimony right before everybody in the religious leadership of the city was about to stone him. And Saul gives approval for his death. On that day, continuing in verse 1, a great persecution broke out against the church at Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. Godly men buried Stephen and mourned deeply for him. But Saul began to destroy the church, going from house to house. He dragged off men and women and put them in prison. This doesn't sound like the right starting place for somebody who's about to be led to that destination that we just read in Acts chapter 19, where he starts to share the word of the Lord, and this whole region hears God's gospel. This doesn't sound like the guy who's going to do that. This sounds like the guy who's actually trying to keep that from happening. Saul is the guy who's actually trying to prevent anything coming from this thing called the way, or Christianity, as it's starting after Jesus ascends into heaven. Here's the first reorientation in Saul and Paul's life. He had to move and be transformed from a man with the wrong mission to the man with the right mission. That's the first reorientation in Saul's life. He had to move from being the man with the wrong mission to the man with the right mission. See, we probably all need some kind of course correction somewhere in our lives. There's some bit of selfishness or greed. There's some part of our ego, or there's something in our way that has us more attracted to our mission than God's mission or purpose for our lives. We probably find ourselves wanting to pursue our own desires instead of God's will for our lives. We probably find ourselves wanting to be me first instead of we first, wanting to be about us and not about them, and really wanting to treat things like they're mine and not his. Right? The last couple of paradigms we looked at the last few weeks. See, Saul was a man with the wrong mission, but if you turn all the way to Acts chapter 27, like I said, we're going to be jumping around in this book. Hang with me, but turn to Acts 27. Look at how the author of the book of Acts, Luke, defines the way he is at work. Look here in verse 21. After the men had gone a long time without food, Paul stood up before them and said, "Men, you should have taken my advice not to sail from Crete. Then you would have spared yourselves this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost." They're in the middle of this incredible storm on their way to Rome. And he says, "Last night, an angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul.'" And it goes on from there, and we start to see that Paul is going wherever the Lord is leading him. We could read it so many different places in Acts chapter 13 where we finally see that Saul has become Paul now, and he goes by that name. He starts going out and healing people. He does these miracles. He does these incredible things because now he's not a man with the wrong mission. He's a man with the right mission. And sometimes we have this willingness to like judge people. I know the church isn't known for being judgmental, but just imagine for a second that if the church was good at judging people, we'd be looking for certain characteristics of different people about what we should see in them if they're going to be a part of what we're doing. If they're going to belong here, then we should see these 4 or 5 things. If they're going to help us get from here to everywhere, then we should be able to see the makings of some kind of promising leader. From the get-go, Saul should have been completely disqualified from consideration because he was he was the man with the wrong mission. And yet, because God's grace, he becomes the man with the right mission. Who has written you off, or who are you writing off from being a part of what God's about to do because they just don't seem to fit some mold of what a leader of a Christian movement should look like? God does amazing things as he reorients us from our mission to his mission. The second way that Saul is reorientated into the way that God wants to lead him is this. He had to go from being the guy with the power to the guy who submitted to Jesus' power and authority. Look at Acts chapter 9. I hope that jumping back and forth in the book of Acts just gives you a kind of a landscape of how God is always at work in Saul's life and how he provides and leads Paul as he leads him to be about this movement that he's called him to. Acts chapter 9, verses 1 and 2. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way or following Jesus, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. He's got the power. Oh man, that sounded like the beginning of a song right there. I'm not going to sing it, okay? But I'm glad that's stuck in your head now. You're welcome. That'll be all your afternoon this afternoon. He is the one who's got all the power that he needs. He doesn't need anybody else to really even do much of anything. He's just going from town to town, and he's able to take who he wants when he wants and throw him into jail or do the same thing he did to Stephen. He's got plenty of power to even sentence people to death. But the transformation that we see in Paul's life when we turn again back to chapter 27, where we just were, is an incredible thing. We just read it a moment ago, and again, you hear in verse 23 of Acts 27, last night an angel of the God whose I am and whom I serve stood beside me and said, don't be afraid. And even as he's saying, don't be afraid to Paul, he says, you must stand trial before Caesar. And God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men. For I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. That doesn't sound like the same guy in chapter 9. This sounds like a different guy who's learned that it's not about his power, but that suddenly much more is happening because he's not relying on his own power. He's relying on the Lord's power in his life. I am his. It's his strength in me. It's his power and authority at work in me. And my guess is that if we're going to move from here to everywhere, we should probably recognize that there's a limitation to our own power. And there's so much untapped power waiting for us just to receive it. Because that's how God gives. And that's how he leads. And that's how he provides. So one, we see this orientation in Saul into Paul's life, that he was transformed from a man with the wrong mission to the right mission. He's used to being the guy with the power to now being the guy submitting to the Lord's power. And the third way that we see Saul and Paul reorienting their lives is that Saul went from a man with no team to a leader who was making teams of disciples. He didn't do this alone. He valued being able to pour his life into the people around him. And this process of making disciples, this process of building teams, that just the need to trust one another. I mean, my guess is you probably don't know everybody that you're sitting with this morning. And if it was easy for us, we'd just go out and we'd just start trusting each other in amazing, miraculous ways. But my guess is, if you're anything like me, it's hard to trust other people. It's hard to build teamwork, right? Because our natural inclination is to just rely on ourselves and do our own thing and go wherever we can go and not consider where the Lord is leading us. But look at the journey of Saul to Paul. We just read in Acts chapter 9 that he was going or about to go from house to house, bringing people out of their houses, throwing them in jail, persecuting them. Saul sets out with no team. But then on his way to persecute anybody that he could find who belonged to the way. Jesus shows up, transforms him, and we see him show back up in chapter 13. This is where we get introduced to Paul, right at the tail end of chapter 12 and right here into chapter 13. Look down at verse 13. Here's where we see that if first Saul starts to be a man without a team, and here in Acts chapter 13, soon after he reunites with everybody, Paul becomes the leader of a team. Look at Acts 13, verse 13. From Paphos, Paul and his companions, just pause right here. Paul and his companions, that means that Paul was identified as the leader, scholars say, and his companions, there were people going with him. And in chapter 13 is where we pick up on how they were going where the Lord was calling them. And everywhere they went, they'd start to share this gospel. So Paul goes from being a man with no team to a man who's leading a team. And then read the rest of verse 13. From Paphos, Paul and his companions sailed to Perga in Pamphylia, where John left them to return to Jerusalem. So in the same verse that we learn that Paul is leading a team, we learn that Paul's team that he's leading starts to fall apart. Way to go, Paul. Good job. John Mark has already dropped out of the race here. He's heading back home. This is just too much. Oh, does that mean Paul's a bad leader? Does that mean Paul isn't doing the right thing because he's got a member of his team? And by team, it's him and Barnabas and John Mark. So when you lose one person of that team, that is a huge percentage of your team, right? I'm not a mathematician, but I think that's a third of the team is now gone. That's catastrophic in a lot of ways. Notice this thing that we would just so quickly read past. Because there's a lot of permission for you in this. There's a lot of grace for you in this. You got to believe if you're Paul in this situation, you're just kind of getting your feet wet into this whole following Jesus thing. You've spent some time learning from other apostles. You've spent some time trying to reorient your life to what Jesus has called you to. But man, the first opportunity you get to lead a team, a third of the team is out, like right away. You know what we're tempted to think in those moments? When things don't go the way that you wanted them to, when people bail out faster than you thought they were going to, when it seems like things are kind of falling apart, the temptation is to think, maybe I wasn't meant for this. Maybe I was supposed to never be a part of a team. Maybe I was never meant to make disciples. Maybe I was never meant to move from here to everywhere. Maybe I just stay here. Isn't that a temptation that you hear regularly? It's like Satan sees that as an opportunity to just kick you while you're down. But it's so amazing because the story doesn't leave here. And actually, some bad news before good news, it gets worse for Paul, okay? Here's what one scholar says about John Mark leaving. We don't get a whole lot. You might just say, well, John Mark left, no big deal. But actually, it caused a lot of problems. Simply put, it appears that he was uncomfortable with the Gentile mission and preaching the gospel to non-Jews. He was really comfortable sharing the gospel with people who were like him from the same tradition that he was. And he was sent out by the Spirit to go and be a part of this. But once he was out in the field, he began to doubt his calling. So John Mark bails. And this causes some friction. Turn to chapter 15. Hang in there with me. Keep trekking. Chapter 15. Look at verse 37 through 39. This whole thing about John Mark bailing on Barnabas and Paul back in chapter 13, it comes back up again. And now Paul goes from a man with no team to a man as a leader of a team to a man whose teams fall apart to now Paul is a man whose team that he's leading splits. Right? So first he's got people bailing from his team. Now his team is splitting. Look at chapter 15, verse 37 to 39. Barnabas, his teammate alongside of him when John Mark left, wanted to take John, this same John Mark, also called Mark, with them. But Paul did not think it was wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had a sharp disagreement that they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left. I mean, this sounds like, let's be honest, sounds like a family reunion gone bad, right? I mean, somebody forgot the fried chicken from KFC at this party, and now everybody's all upset, and they want to be a part of something else. They don't want to journey alongside. So really, yeah, we can talk about the destination. We can talk about chapter 19 and how all of this region comes to hear the word of the Lord and how amazing that is. But man, there's a hard road to go from here to everywhere. And Paul goes from no team to finally having a team, to that team abandoning him, to that team splitting, until we get to chapter 19, which is where we started, and you get this incredible destination. And the only thing that makes sense for how any of this could work, the only way that it makes sense that it could go from Saul in chapter 7 and 8, breathing these murderous threats, if that's here, and chapter 19 is everywhere, where Asia comes to hear the whole word of the Lord in 2 years, the only way you get from here to everywhere is if God is somehow masterfully at work in the midst of all of it. Because that is not how we would have schemed it up. Going to build a team, everything's going to be awesome and harmonious, we'll never have conflict. That didn't work out the way I wanted to. It's all right, we're gonna build energy again, we're gonna build some momentum again, and now we're gonna get going, and man, there's another roadblock. Maybe I wasn't meant for this. Man, Satan just wants to rub that in our faces, and it just puts doubt in the midst of the faith that we have. But because God is faithful, because he's the only way that they could have gone from there to everywhere, he's the only way that we can go from here to everywhere. And you might say, yeah, but Dave, you don't understand like where here is for me right now. Like things are not healthy in my relationships. Work is not going the way that we wanted to. We're not living in the neighborhood we thought we would. Things are just chaotic. I'm too busy. I got this, I got that. Man, it sounds like actually the perfect starting place if you ask a guy named Saul. It actually sounds like the perfect place for God to reorient us, doesn't it? If we're waiting for the picture perfect moment, we're putting our faith in ourselves instead of in God to transform and do something amazing. Don't forget how beautiful the destination is that we're talking about. Don't forget where Paul ended up being in chapter 19, all that he saw along the way. Because every time it gets hard, we need to be absolutely convinced that the destination, it's worth it. Even if right now I feel some doubt, even if there's some conflict, even if things didn't go the way that I thought, even if somebody left the team, or even if something like this happened in my life, I'm still going to keep going from here to everywhere because God is at work. Don't forget how good the destination is. Here's what the destination sounds like. It sounds like, because we're serving with foster care in Middle Tennessee, it sounds like instead of kids waiting for a forever home and waiting for a family to accept them, there's actually families waiting for a kid that's looking for a forever home. Changing who's waiting. Which, by the way, that's what all the money, the proceeds for your tickets for Good Friday Nashville are going to help do. Here's what the destination looks like. It looks like racial chasms being bridged and there being reconciliation, where neighbors are loving one another. It looks like something where the homeless and the hungry are being fed and brought off the streets, where the marginalized are loved and empowered. And if none of that is enough of a reminder of how sweet the destination is, then might I just help us remember how beautiful our final home, our true home will be. Man, sometimes we just forget how good that destination's gonna be. And man, we can spend all month in January and February Googling warm vacation spots, but it just doesn't compare. I mean, how often does some form of imperfection in your life, maybe it's an email that rubs you the wrong way, or a conversation, or your addiction, or your ego, it just ruins part of your day, or it begins to start to ruin your relationships, or it even starts to eat away at your identity. Because in those moments, man, we forget how good the destination is. We forget where we're going, because right now it just looks too daunting, too paralyzing to move from here to everywhere. But Jesus is about telling a story that has this destination, and it's called paradise. Literally, he calls it paradise. And when we get there, we're going to look back and say, man, it was so worth it. Oh, there's little reminders of it right now. I mean, there's little reminders. For those of you that served at Room in the Inn on Friday night, Saturday morning, you got a glimpse, and you probably walked away from that saying, man, that was worth it. I didn't really want to make that meal, and I didn't really want to give up my Friday night, or I didn't really want to wake up at 5 a.m. on Saturday morning, but gosh, that was worth it. For those of you inviting your friends to Good Friday Nashville, maybe it's kind of uncomfortable. You're not sure how they're going to respond, or inviting them to Rhythm City or to be a part of your community group. You're not quite sure, so there's like this tension, this discomfort, but man, it's worth it. Oh, for the 15 of you that were in partnership class this morning, oh, it is so worth it. What a blessing it is to me and our church to get to be a part of that with you. Just very briefly, when we consider moving from here to everywhere, how God's calling us to be a part of something that goes beyond just these walls, goes beyond Sunday morning, but starts to impact the lives of people that are around you all the time. Just three real simple, very quick things to remember. Number one, Paul used to be Saul, which means two things. You are not who you used to be. You might need to chew on that a little bit more. You are not who you used to be, and the friends and neighbors that you love today will not be the same as they are today. You're not defined any longer by your past. You might have the scars, but you are healed. Number two, God does amazing things, but he almost always does them in the context of community, so don't go alone. If you're trying to go from here to everywhere, if our church is trying to go from here to everywhere, we can't do it alone. We need to go together. So who is discipling you, or who are you discipling? We see that in chapter 19. People were following along with Paul. They got to do life with him and see these things. And the final thing that we need to hear is this: God will do these things. God will move from here to everywhere. He accomplishes those things through us. So it's not on my shoulders. It's not on our shoulders to muster up and try harder and do these things, but just simply allow the Spirit of God to be at work in us. I couldn't find anything on how many people were in the region of Asia when Paul and his disciples started sharing the word of the Lord over those 2 years. But the number that keeps me awake is the number 800,000. And it's probably growing every day with the number of people moving to Nashville. That's the number of people disconnected from a faith community in our neighborhoods. I wonder what God's going to do through you, through us, over the next 2 years, the next 5 years. It's hard for me to believe 800,000. No way. But if God is doing that, and he's working through us, that will be worth it. That will be worth it.